me when you see me, come and make some room.
Everywhere I go, I'm in the spotlight. This is a good life. I'm living bold. This is what it looks like on the tip-top of the world.
Do you know the difference between the Federal Maritime Commission and the Maritime Administration, FMC and MARAD? But, do you really know the difference? Well, stick around. I'm going to clear up all the confusion today. Hi, welcome to By Land and By Sea, an attorney breaking down the week in supply chain, presented by the Maritime Professor, me. I'm Lauren Began, founder of the Maritime Professor and Squall Strategies, and I'm your favorite maritime attorney. Join me every week as we walk through both ocean transport and surface transport topics in the wild world of supply chain. As always, the guidance here is general and for educational purposes only. It should not be construed to be legal advice, and there is no attorney-client privilege created by this video. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. So before we get into the discussion of the day, let's go through my top 3 stories of the week. All right, story number 1. We're going to be back on FMC rulemaking watch here, right? So after the passing of OSRA, the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022, which was June 16th of 2022, so almost a year ago, we started watching 3 major rulemakings that the FMC had been assigned by Congress. The first being the unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate with respect to vessel space accommodations. The second being detention and demurrage billing requirements. And the third being unfair or unjustly discriminatory methods, which was set to define unfair or unjustly discriminatory methods under the Shipping Act. So the first of those rulemakings was actually required to be completed by December 16th. This was the unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate with respect to vessel space accommodations. But the Federal Maritime Commission Chair Dan Maffei said, getting it right is more important than getting it fast. So that first rulemaking is still forthcoming, even though it was supposed to be finished up by December 16th. Chairman Dan Maffei has actually said that this one's a pretty tricky one in terms of getting it right. And so they want to make sure that they're taking their time as they're drafting the language. And they got some really interesting comments on the first round of that rulemaking in the comment period. And so what they're actually doing is opening it back up for a supplemental comment period. We're still waiting on that. We're still waiting on the revised supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking, which will be coming out. And I'm thinking that's probably going to be coming out sooner rather than later. We're certainly past the 6-month requirement, the December 16th. We're coming up on the 1 year, so I think they're probably feeling a little bit of urgency to get out that supplemental rulemaking before the 1 year mark, just so they're hitting some of the benchmarks, right? But that first rulemaking, I think it's coming soon. I really think that we're going to start seeing a flurry of some activity coming out of the Federal Maritime Commission. I think that supplemental rulemaking is also the supplemental comment period is also going to be probably around the same time, if not maybe the same day, as the second rule that was on the list, the detention and demurrage billing requirements. So remember, this was the second one. This is the one everybody was really, really leaning in on, watching closely, commenting, right? We had over 180 comments filed when that last comment period closed last December. So I expect the final rule text is going to be out on this one as well, probably in the next couple of weeks. I'm thinking, look, the June 16th date is coming up. 14 days, 2 weeks from now, right? That's the 1 year deadline. This second rule was required to be finished up 1 year post OSRA. So technically, I guess if they get the final text out by the 1 year mark, it could count it as like a check mark-ish. I don't know. I just think that this June 16th date is something that the FMC is probably pushing for, trying to get these 2 rulemakings out. So once they start going into, well, what have you done under OSRA in the past year, they can start to point to some of these things and say, well, we got the supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking out on the first rule by the 1 year mark. And hopefully they can say we got the detention demurrage billing requirements final text out by the 1 year mark. The third rule that was on the list, the unfair or unjustly discriminatory methods, which is defining unfair or unjustly discriminatory methods under the Shipping Act, we haven't seen any text yet on. I know that they're working on it, but unfair, unjustly discriminatory methods, I can imagine this is probably a pretty tricky rulemaking to write proposed text for. I don't know if we're going to see an advance notice of proposed rulemaking on this, which is, we've talked about that before. Basically, an ANPRM, or an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, is where you see a rulemaking where the agency is kind of sending questions out into the industry saying, here's what we're thinking, but we're not quite sure. What do you guys think? I think, and I think from some of the language that we've heard from some of the commissioners and certainly from the chairman in the budget hearing, that they are going to be bringing forth a notice of proposed rulemaking, so actual text around this one. But I can imagine that this is going to be tricky because the FMC tends to like having case law get prescriptive and specific with some of the nuances, right? They want the actual fact pattern, and then they want some rule that they're going to be applying to that fact pattern. They prefer the rulemakings, I think, my general sense, it seems, is that they prefer the rulemakings to set the general guardrails and kind of be the parameters on the outside of it, but not too prescriptive, not too restrictive. They still want the business and the industry to lead it, but they have to make sure that there are some guardrails on the industry. So this is kind of forcing the FMC to be a little bit more descriptive, specific in the rulemaking. So I think that's maybe what the FMC, I don't know. We'll see what they come out with for their text here, their proposed text. But I think that's maybe what is hanging this one up a little bit, because you're required, if you're defining unfair, unjust, or discriminatory methods, you have to put forth some specifics, right? And that maybe we'll see the guardrails as those specifics. Maybe we'll still see general categories of unfair, unjustly discriminatory methods. But this one I'm really, really interested to see. I think shippers are going to probably benefit from this one, right? Unfair, unjustly discriminatory methods. Certainly the intention, I think, when the rule was assigned to the FMC from Congress was with shippers in mind. I can imagine that the FMC is going to open it up and just make sure that things are fair and not unjust across the board. But that's also tricky too. So this one, I'm so excited to see the language on this one. I'm hopeful that in the next few weeks this is going to come out as well. But now what? We have all three of them hopefully dropping at the same time. My guess is we see the first one, the unfair, the unreasonable, unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate with respect to vessel-based accommodations. I think we see that one come out in the short term. Hopefully in the next 2 weeks. Detention demurrage billing requirements, I think we see that one come out at the same time because everybody's waiting on that one to come out. This third one, I'm hopeful it comes out at the same time, but then that's three all at the same time. So my guess is we're probably going to see this third one, unfair, unjustly discriminatory methods, bumped a little bit, and maybe July or August if we don't see it in June. I'm hopeful we see it in June. But if we don't, I think it's going to be coming out this summer. I think one of the budget documents had put August on it, but then I've also heard certainly commissioners and staff talking about this coming out in June, July. So this summer, I think is their target for sure. This one was required to be finished by the 1-year mark of OSRA 22. But again, like I said, Chairman Maffei knows that. He wants to be studious with the time, but he also wants to make sure that they're getting it right. These are some pretty major things, and these rulemakings don't go into effect right away, right? It takes a while to get it right. It's taken a year to get some of the language crafted just so that now we're going to be hopefully getting a final rule on the detention and demurrage. But that can't, it just wasn't going to happen immediately. And so if they are going to take a little bit of time, they want to make sure that they're getting it right. That's what I see here. I'm going to keep watching all of this. I'll let you know what I see. I think we're in the countdown. I think the next few weeks. So put it back on your radar. Keep watching the FMC website, but certainly keep watching and listening to By Land and By Sea. I'll keep you up to date on everything that's going on with these rulemakings. All right, so story number 2. Last week out of the JOC, Eric Johnson released an article titled "Shippers Bemoan Lack of Progress in Ocean Visibility Despite Heavy Investment." So in this article, he quotes shippers as saying that The data is still not reliable across the board. And despite many data visibility platforms entering the market, the shippers are saying they just don't find that data reliable. It was a pretty interesting article. I think I have two things to say generally about this, though. One, first off, I think this all takes time, right? And we've only, age is old as time, right? This industry is as old as time. Supply chain, shipping, it really is. But look, I know everybody wants this done fast. The push and the desire is there, which is truly really the first hurdle, right? I think that's what COVID did, is it made it mainstream to understand the supply chain, or certainly be exposed to the supply chain. But changing an industry that is truly a paper-based industry into a digital data with clear visibility industry probably takes a lot longer than a year, or even 2 or 3 if we're looking at the start of the pandemic being the real new push of people wanting to change this. I think it's been coming for a long time. I think that shippers and carriers alike, I think everybody in the supply chain has wanted change and updates and visibility over data, but to really get that desire, that impetus, that push, that catalyst in the industry is what it all needed to move. We've gotten that, right? We've gotten that, and now everybody's rolling up their sleeves, getting to work. And so I think it's a little premature, a little unfair to say that despite heavy investment, shippers are still bemoaning lack of progress. I get it. You want to see things move. I get it. But look, my second thought here is this is why standards are important, right? It's one thing to have raw data, but if the data points aren't actually aligned so that you can rely on a common definition, then you're going to be in trouble. So here's how I guess I was kind of thinking about it. If the data point is fruit, right? And in your mind, you're thinking apples. But for somebody else, it's oranges, right? That's the problem. They're still both fruit. And it's kind of like the raw data coming in the supply chain. If you have arrival times, right? That could be actual vessel arrival. That could be when the pilot meets the vessel. That could be when it's moored. Arrival time has a million different definitions within it. Kind of like detention, demurrage, and per diem, right? We've talked about that quite a bit as we were talking about the detention and demurrage rulemaking. And really any other terms that are a little squishy still. This is where those standards are important, because you could say, well, I need data visibility on arrival times of vessels. But if you don't define what that is, and if you don't all act as though it's the same, of course it's going to be unreliable data because it doesn't have that consistency. And so you can't rely on it because it's not telling you what you really need. You're saying, I need a fruit, and somebody gives you an orange, but then somebody else gives you an apple. And somebody else throws in a tomato, and you're like, I don't even think this is a fruit. Point being, look, we need to kind of make sure that we're creating great foundational starts. I think we're making a lot of good headway here, but we have to really continue to push forward on these common terms and data standards, and that really is step one. I think the industry is starting to come around to that. I think the industry is really understanding that you can have these fun, flashy platforms, which is great, which is tech that we need, but we also need to make sure that we're all stepping forward together on a solid foundation. All right, story number 3. Look, I didn't have a lot of fresh news this week. I'm still watching. There's some labor negotiation discussions going on. I wanted to give that a little bit more time to see what's going on. There was some talk of things happening this morning. But all that to say, I was really excited to be on the Lloyd's List podcast this week, talking about the different legislative movements on the Hill and the implementation of OSRA 22. So, you know what? I'm going to plug it. It's only 20 minutes. Go have a listen while you're heading down to the beach this weekend. It was a really great conversation. And look, I'm going to mention it again, right? Go check out the Lloyd's List podcast from this week. It was pretty fun talking about OSRA 22, all the things that have happened since the implementation, and all the new legislative stuff, including the markup from the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee meeting that was last week. We covered that a little bit last week, but on that podcast, we go into it in a little more depth. All right, so let's get into the meat and potatoes of the day then. So we have 2 different agencies. We're talking about 2 very different agencies. They're sister agencies, sure, but the Federal Maritime Commission and MARAD, the Maritime Administration, are 2 very different and by design agencies. So the Federal Maritime Commission is an independent federal regulatory agency. Independent. I'm going to keep harping on that. They're independent. Whereas MARAD, the Maritime Administration, is an agency within the Department of Transportation. So that's one of the administration's cabinet-level agencies. So meaning close connection with the sitting president's office and one of the advisors on the stated subject matter. So that's why we have Secretary Pete Buttigieg as the Secretary of Transportation, very close and often part of the Biden administration's discussion topics, because that's a cabinet-level agency. Secretary Pete Buttigieg is part of the cabinet because he's the Secretary of Transportation. And then you have the Maritime Administrator, which is the lead role of one of those agencies within DOT. So it's still in the lineage of a cabinet-level agency. The Federal Maritime Commission doesn't have that. They're not a cabinet-level agency. So the FMC is the independent regulatory agency, and they're charged with regulating the movement of ocean-borne cargo for the benefit of the U.S. exporter, importer, and U.S. consumer. All right, so what does that mean? Independent regulatory agency. They're independent. They're not part of the cabinet-level agency, right? So they are independent. Similar to FCC, Federal Communications Commission, SEC, Securities Exchange Commission, FTC, Federal Trade Commission. Those are all independent federal regulatory agencies. Whereas the cabinet level is part of the administration. So it's independent. That's important to know. It's this independent nature that really allows it to be insulated from political changes in the administration. So they're also charged with regulating the movement of ocean-borne cargo for the benefit of the U.S. exporter, importer, and U.S. consumer. They're looking out for people who are moving things, people who are shipping things, and people who are buying things because of the resultant supply chain. Basically, they're in charge of the global supply chain as it affects the United States. They regulate that. So that's what the Federal Maritime Commission does. So, like I said, they are insulated from political changes in the administration. Sure, the president can actually appoint the chairman of the FMC, but they can't set the entire commission lineup with the change of the administration. The commissioners are on a 5-year staggered term. So there's 5 commissioners. So basically every year, a new commissioner is up for nomination and confirmation. So they're on a 5-year staggered term, and while they're nominated by the president, they have to be confirmed by the Senate. So there's the check and balance there, right? But that only happens when one of their terms is up. And so there's 5-year staggered terms. So every year there's somebody else up. So there is a fair amount of turnover or potential turnover. But, you know, it still has to go through the Senate process. So contrast that with MARAD. So there's only one person in charge, not a commission of 5 commissioners. And you could say there's more than one person in charge, but Maritime Administrator Ann Phillips is the lead, Admiral Ann Phillips, retired admiral. The role of Maritime Administrator doesn't change necessarily with administration changes. The Maritime Administrator is always there, and it's different from the 5 commissioners being the chairman. And I don't want to get too complicated here, but so there's the Maritime Administrator, and she certainly has a deputy. I should also note that the President Executive Office can only make recommendations to the FMC for action. They can only make recommendations. They cannot direct the FMC to do something. Now, that was getting a little confused when we were kind of in the height of COVID, and everybody was trying to figure out, well, who does what? Who can we direct to fix this? And so a few of the political pieces coming out were saying, well, tell FMC to do this. And I remember at the time, I think Chairman Dan Maffei said, essentially, I don't remember exactly what he said, but he's like, thank you for the recommendation. We will take that under advisement. Because that's it, right? The administration, executive offices can only make recommendations to the FMC for action. Now, because the president does choose the chairman, they tend to be same party lines, so they tend to want to work together. But important to note, right, that independent nature, and it's fiercely protected because it is so important to how the FMC works and interacts with the other federal agencies. So the only people who can actually direct the FMC to do something is Congress. Congress can send legislation through and direct the FMC, and that's why they're getting their to-do list, as Chairman Dan Maffei usually says. They have their to-do list from Congress because that came through in OSRA 22. That's another way that the FMC actually does stay more insulated from politics. It takes the entire Congress to pass something to direct the FMC to act in specificity. We just saw that happen, like I said, with the congressional passage of the Ocean Shipping Reform Act. And we're seeing that tried with the new versions, the Ocean Shipping Reform Implementation Act, where they're trying to get a couple new things, but really it's only on the House side yet. They're going to need a Senate pair, a Senate partner bill. And we haven't seen that yet. So it is pretty hard to get this legislation through just to tell the FMC to change things or to tell the FMC, look, we're giving you more or less authority or whatever it is. So the FMC, as an agency, their mission statement is to ensure a competitive and reliable international ocean transportation supply system that supports the U.S. economy and protects the public from unfair and deceptive practices. So there's a few buzzwords in there. Competitive, reliable, protects the public. They're kind of a competition authority, right? They're kind of like the Federal Trade Commission. They are really they're regulating this international ocean transportation supply system, but as it affects the U.S. economy and as it affects the U.S. public. Whereas MARAD's mission statement is to foster, promote, and develop the maritime industry of the United States to meet the nation's economic and security needs. So like I said, just looking at those words, FMC has protect the public, competitive, whereas MARAD is foster, promote, and develop. So protect competition versus foster, promote, and develop. So really, FMC is the regulatory arm, while MARAD is the promotional arm. And they used to be under the same agency. They used to be the Federal Maritime Board, but they were split kind of based on, at least in part, those reasons. You can't have the same entity regulating the industry also be giving out money in the form of grants and funding to the industry, right? And so when you think about it, MARAD certainly does have some international elements to it, but really they are more of the domestic promotion, U.S. flag fleet, U.S. maritime interests, and U.S. maritime kind of internal-ish, domestic-ish, whereas the Federal Maritime Commission is really kind of looking, they're flag neutral. They're looking at the entire ecosystem of the supply chain and how it affects the U.S. So they're looking at the whole picture, and anybody who wants to do business with the U.S. is going to have to go through the Federal Maritime Commission. But like I said, these two agencies used to be one. They used to be the Federal Maritime Board, which was actually an agency within the Department of Commerce. So Department of Commerce, think NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. That's the National Weather Service, Economic Development Administration. The Patent and Trade Office is there, PTO. These are all offices of the Department of Commerce, and the Federal Maritime Board used to be one of those. But in 1961, the two agencies split and they went their separate ways. So MARAD over to the Department of Transportation and the FMC to be an independent regulatory agency. It made sense for MARAD to be over in the Department of Transportation because now it was kind of regarded as another mode of transport, right? Which is probably appropriately where there should have been a maritime presence. Coast Guard actually used to be under Department of Transportation as well. And then they got moved into a more military, appropriately so, area. But there was some shifting going on all around the same time. I kind of like how it all has fallen out, how the cards have played out. But so the FMC became an independent regulatory agency and MARAD went to the Department of Transportation. The FMC, as I said, was charged with regulating the U.S. ocean commerce, and MARAD was formed to promote America's merchant marine and oversee an emergency reserve of cargo ships for use in times of conflict. I'm going to repeat that. The MARAD was formed to promote America's merchant marine. To promote America's merchant marine. So that is the vessels and the people, right? Merchant mariners. They're credentialed through the Coast Guard, but MARAD is promoting it. They are creating education around it. They are encouraging people to go into the merchant marine. But they're also overseeing emergency reserve of cargo ships for use in times of conflict. So let's dive into MARAD a little bit here. So from their website, in the About section, I'm just going to read it off. MARAD is the DOT agency responsible for America's waterborne transportation system. Continuing on, they support the technical aspects of America's maritime transportation infrastructure. That's what I was talking about earlier, right? MARAD is very critical to maritime transportation infrastructure. They're giving out the money, among other things, but they're helping to build up this infrastructure. Continuing on, things like ships and shipping, port and vessel operations, national security, environment, and safety. MARAD promotes the use of waterborne transportation and ensures that its infrastructure integrates seamlessly with other methods of transportation. Like I said, it makes sense that they're part of DOT because they really are trying to create this ecosystem, this network of all of the transportations together. And that at least hierarchically makes sense because they're with the other modes of transportation under Department of Transportation. Continuing on from the website About Us section, MARAD also maintains a fleet of cargo ships in reserve to provide surge sea lift during war and national emergencies, and is responsible for disposing of ships in that fleet, as well as other non-combatant government ships as they become obsolete. All right, so let's break all that down. They're part of keeping the domestic maritime engine moving, right? So FMC is more of the global supply chain that touches the U.S. We've talked about that. And it regulates that space, whereas MARAD helps support, promote, and ensure that the U.S. is a competitive maritime force in the world through this infrastructure development, and specifically that Ready Reserve Fleet. So what is this Ready Reserve Fleet? This is such an important and critical piece, and something that actually is in the conversation, certainly on the Hill, is we need to build up this Ready Reserve Fleet. It's the fleet of cargo ships that are ready in reserve, ready to be activated if and when we should ever need them. And we really don't have a ton, and we need to get more. And that's where MARAD is, among all the things that they're working on, that's where one of the things that they're working on is. We need to have, sure, we have our Navy, we have our Coast Guard operations as part of our military team that usually have a notion of water to them, and even some of the other maritime components of the otherwise landside military branches. So we have our fleet of ready in those military branches, but we also have this Ready Reserve Fleet that basically gets activated. So whenever we activate the otherwise traditional military branches, you're still going to need the heavy stuff, the supplies, the extra stuff that isn't automatically flown in but is brought in later. Maybe extra vessels, maybe extra cargo boxes that you're going to be setting up for staging areas. It's all that extra stuff that doesn't necessarily need to be first thing on the ground, but you'll need that extra support. And so that's where these otherwise commercial vessels can be turned into the Ready Reserve Fleet and basically brought up when activated. And so that's why it's important that these commercial vessels are also ready and in their design ready to be part of this Ready Reserve Fleet should we need them. Right? It's a great idea to kind of have this extra fleet of vessels that otherwise is doing commercial activity, but when ready, when needed, can be activated. So the last thing I want to point out here too is MARAD is an enormous agency compared to the Federal Maritime Commission. MARAD has about 800 employees. Compare that to the Federal Maritime Commission, which traditionally has been around about 120. I think right now they're maybe around 150, and they've been given budgetary approval to get up to the 160, 180 employees range. It's a small agency. It's less than a quarter of the Federal Maritime Commission is less than a quarter of the employees that are over at MARAD. Look, these aren't value judgment. It's just, I just wanted to highlight the two differences here. I'm so thrilled that people are coming around to understanding what the Federal Maritime Commission is, but I think it's also important that whereas you maybe previously thought, oh, MARAD, maritime, it's not that generic, and that they both have very specific and very purposeful missions within the, oh, it's maritime kind of general thought, right? So both agencies are critically important to the overall health of maritime, certainly as it relates to the U.S. and the supply chain ecosystem. But simply put, MARAD is the promotional arm, right? Promoting a strong, vibrant maritime community in the United States. And the FMC is the regulatory arm, ensuring the fair and efficient movement of goods and services into and out of the U.S. economy, and really how the global supply chain affects or does business with the U.S. economy. All right, as always, the guidance here is general and for educational purposes. It should not be construed to be legal advice directly related to your matter. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. But if you have specific legal questions, feel free to reach out to me at my legal company, Skull Strategies. I hope that was helpful going through the FMC and the MARAD differences. We've done it before. I think it's always great to be a refresher. Otherwise, for the non-legal questions, the e-learning, and the general industry information and insights, come find me at the Maritime Professor. If you like these videos, let me know. Comment, like, and share. If you want to listen to these episodes on demand, or if you missed any previous episodes, check out the podcast By Land and By Sea. If you prefer to see the video, they live on my YouTube page, By Land and By Sea, presented by the Maritime Professor. And while you're at it, check out the website, themaritimeprofessor.com. So until next week, this is Lauren Began, the Maritime Professor, and you've just listened to By Land and By Sea.